Hello, welcome to Secure the Continent and News Central Television. I am Gbenga Aborowa. This is the program where we bring you up to speed with all the security happenings on the African continent. But before we delve into a major discussion for today's program, let me first bring you the latest security headlines across the continent. DR Congo, South Africa signed security pact to combat militias. Aid agencies in Sudan raise alarm over rise in rape and abductions. Kenyan police fire tear gas to stop tax hike protesters. And in Mali, a United Nations convoy was attacked by armed men. Don't go anywhere. I will be right back after this. Now, the program today will take a holistic look at the situation in Burkina Faso, where years of conflict and a recent spike in militant attacks have displaced at least 2 million people in the West African country. The current situation does not look like one that will subside anytime soon, as almost 20 civilians were killed by suspected terrorists earlier this week in the nation's capital. Before we delve into the conversation, we have an overview of the situation in this report. Take a listen.
Has endured a series of terrorist attacks on its civilian population in one of Africa's most disturbing cases of insecurity. Thousands of people have been killed in the last 8 years and at least 2 million displaced from their original homes. The Burkina government has also had to deal with internal struggles, including military coups, stemming from its inability to find solutions to this major problem. In the latest killings, nearly 15 persons were killed by suspected terrorists in Soga, in the eastern province, sparking new wave of fears of another bloodshed. Despite the presence of foreign forces, Burkina Faso still faces a great deal of security troubles. The Burkina military also recently revealed it has pushed some terrorists back, as 50 suspected terrorists were also killed in a clash that saw the death of 33 soldiers. The attacks on civilians have been gruesomely consistent and currently constitute one of the Sahel's greatest security upheavals. With solutions barely in sight, what the future holds is still greatly beyond anybody's knowledge. The international community has also pushed for an end to the current troubles, but the Sahel remains one of the security hotspots of the continent and the world.
Tonight, to discuss this, I have Dr. Lassane Ouedraogo, research fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development, and also David Otto, director for Geneva's Center for African Security and Strategic Studies. Both distinguished guests join me from Nigeria's capital, Abuja. One welcome to you, gentlemen, and thanks for joining me on the program tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Now, I'd like to start with you, Dr. Ouedraogo. Can you give us context and background as to how we got here in the first place? How did Burkina Faso go from being spared most of the jihadist attacks in the Sahel to now being the center of jihadist violence in the Sahel in less than a decade?
We have to walk back to 2015 when Burkina Faso experienced its very first terrorist attack. And things have since evolved because the attack from 2015 is quite different from what we are observing today. In 2015, the attack were targeting major buildings in the capital city. And those were isolated terrorist attacks. And since then, the situation has evolved to become extremely dire, considering the latest development in terms of regions and entire swaths of land that are not accessible today in the country. They started like a mere terrorist attack in the capital city, 2015, but so much has happened since then. To recall that in 2014, Burkina Faso had a popular revolution to uproot its 27-year dictator,
Blaise
Blaise Compaoré.
Compaoré.
And after the departure of Blaise Compaoré, we had a military coup that failed, but we were able to organize 2 consecutive elections, electing for the very first time our civilian leader, someone who did not have anything to do with the army. And then, but unfortunately, under the tenure of that civilian government, things have gotten from worse to worse every day. And until 2020, when we had a coup against that civilian leader and another coup again. So recording 2 consecutive coups in less than a year. So, and during all of this time, one must say that there has been terrorism has been growing from the eastern side of the country, but also from the northern border with Mali, and of very recently the jihadist, I don't even call it jihadist attack, I call it terrorist attack, is now spreading toward the border, the coastal border with Ghana and Togo and Benin. So pretty much all the, Burkina share border with at least 5 countries. So at all of these borders, we have terrorist movements. So, and you must also account for the fact that our military was not well equipped at the beginning of this conflict. It was an army that was not equipped, that was not really, really ready for this kind of conflict. It was an army that was, for the most part, at the service of a sitting dictator, and also an army that was reduced to pretty much a ceremonial army. So, but say what you like, but since the 2 recent coups, there has been some evolution within the army. There has been some major changes. There has been some major acquisition of weapons. There has been some major reshuffles and reorganization of the army that is allowing them today to take the fight to the terrorists. So it's no longer the terrorists surprising the military and killing them in numbers, but it's also the military going toward the terrorists and inflicting casualty among them.
Thank you, Dr. Ouedraogo. I'd like to bring in David Otto in Abuja into the conversation. Now, David, Dr. Ouedraogo just gave us some historical context into it, and the fact that this violence is now threatening coastal West African states just shows you how much it has evolved since 2015. Now, the mutinous soldiers who ousted Burkina Faso's Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Demiba last year vowed that they will do a better job at stopping the extremist violence rocking the country. It's now 9 months since Captain Ibrahim Traore and his junta took over. We're witnessing a surge in the violence. Things seem to be worse. Looking at the present situation, why is this so? And why is it so difficult to combat extremist violence in Burkina Faso?
Well, there could be several reasons. You rightly said Captain Ibrahim Traore, who is the president now of the junta. One of the key things that they used as a justification for the coup, was that his predecessors, did not have an answer to the level of insecurity and to the economic challenges that Burkina Faso does face. But of course, that doesn't translate to criticisms alone, doesn't translate to solutions, especially when it comes to dealing with, jihadist activities or terrorist activities run by groups known as, Al-Qaeda in the Greater Sahel, but also an ISIS faction that they call Geneva. It's also present there. I think one of the challenges that one usually faces is that you underestimate the capacity and the reach of these non-state actors. And I think without a strategy to deal with it, and usually that strategy is not something that you can deploy overnight, because of course jihadist movement they are very good at entrenching themselves within the local population. Remember, in the case of Nigeria, for example, the jihadists spread from the central Borno to the northern part, and then across countries like Cameroon and Niger. So you can tell that
it's not a conventional. It's not a conventional type of battle. It's almost like a cat and mouse situation.
Yes. It's a horizontal warfare, we call it, these movements or these groups, they live amongst the people, and it becomes very difficult, to deploy military tactics alone. I think one of the biggest misconceptions that military leaders do have is that they tell the population that they have the answers. They can defeat these movements on their own. But it usually takes more than that. It takes, some kind of a much more comprehensive, people-led approach. So one of the mistakes that I believe the military junta made was that it reassured the population that it will deploy its military forces to deal with the jihadists, and that would be the end of it. But it doesn't normally translate to that as easily as we think. So these attacks that we have seen are normal attacks, that insurgency groups carry on when they have, countries that do not have control of the ungoverned spaces, when they have countries that do not have control of, or perhaps, a robust, strategic plan to deal with them. So Burkina Faso is not isolated in this sense, and geographically, one must admit that this is a country that is placed in the Liptako-Goma Triangle, which borders Niger Republic. It also borders Mali. These are countries that have these elements coming from left, right, and center. So what normally happens is that you have what you call balloon effect, where you defeat or you push away the terrorists from one side of the borders. They easily run to the other side of the borders, and then they come back using ambush tactics. So I believe that the key problem here for Burkina Faso and the young leader, Captain Ibrahim Traore, is that he has promised more than what he can deliver. But I think the solution and the way forward is to revert back to a much more comprehensive strategy. That doesn't only involve the military, but involves dealing with some of those underlying forces that groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS are using to recruit young people and engage in terrorist attacks. It's a very difficult area, I have to say, Gbenga. These are very porous borders. So it will take more than Burkina Faso. It will have to take some kind of a regional approach. So it's a long one, I have to say.
Thank you very much, David Otto. Now, back to you, Dr. Ouedraogo. David just mentioned the situation is very complex. He talked about the balloon effect. It's beyond Burkina Faso's borders. But Captain Ibrahim Traore is not just sitting and letting things happen. He's also trying to rejig the military architecture and move things around. Now, Burkina Faso recently announced an exceptional recruitment of 5,000 soldiers to serve the army at least 5 years as part of the fight against this violent extremism, according to a statement from the Ministry of Defense transmitted. We've also heard about the VDP, the Volunteer Defense Groups, the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, the civilian groups that try to defend the country from violent extremism. How much of a difference will this make, and how effective have the introduction of the VDP and civilian defense groups into the fight against extremism, how much difference have they made?
Well, you see, everyone is talking about the necessity to have programs beyond the military intervention, beyond the military solution, to have other programs, to have other ways of dealing with the conflict. But it's my understanding through either observing, but also interacting with actors on the ground, that to be able to utilize any other plan, the military plan has to come first. And hence the recruitment of the volunteers for the defense of the fatherland, hence the recruitment of more men to join the army. The reason is very simple. In the program of Captain Traore, it's not just that they're going to drive the terrorists outside of the region or outside of the country and it's over. Each time a village is conquered back, you need to be able to have men there. You need to be able to reorganize the return of the civilians, the farmers to their lands. And in order to do that, you need to have the administration there. And the administration is not going to return if there's no security. And those tend to be places where the administration was not, the security forces were not present. So, and it's so difficult to place a military personnel in every single one of the villages in our towns. So what do you do if you want to bring the administration back? What do you do when you want to reorganize agriculture to allow farmers to go back and farm? How do you proceed if you do not have the manpower to actually secure it, but also to allow people to return progressively to their hometowns? And I think those who are suggesting other mechanisms are not wrong. It's just that the process of going about doing it, implementing those solutions, require that in the first place, the zones be ridden off the terrorists. The first thing to do is to make sure there's no weapons, with men with weapons other than our men in a given village or a given town. The second would be to now move into that town with some sort of programs to allow people to return to their normal days activities. So, and to respond to your question clearly, since the arrival of Captain Traore, things have changed. Things have evolved in a certain way. And the one thing that I would say has changed is that Burkina Faso are having more and more hope that they will be able to reconquer the land. More and more people still believe that in the coming months, in the coming years, they will be able to return to farming, they'll be returning to the agricultural practices and so on and so forth. And there are so many small mechanisms that are being put in place, but you cannot implement those mechanisms if you do not have security in the first place. And that's where there's a sort of disconnect from people who are observing, oftentimes from afar, and they're only seeing the military moving around. They don't see the other mechanisms in place.
Now, there are also critics of the government in Ouedraogo. They say they're using this volunteer defense forces members as a cannon fodder for the military, and that they just, after a few weeks of training, they send them to the meat grinder. How do you respond to this sort of allegations?
I think those could be serious allegations, but the primary function of the VDP are not to go in the front line. They are always behind the army. So when a zone is secured, and usually those VDP are from the town, they're recruited from a specific town, and when the zone is liberated, they are supposed to take charge to occupy and organize their own folks and allow the administration to return. So the primary fundamental presence of the VDP is not to go and fight. They're not the ones on the front line. And that I have returned recently from Burkina Faso, and I've traveled to some regions like the Yaoundé region, whereby the VDP, when they sense that there's the presence of some terrorist groups in a given location, the first thing is to organize and send the message up to the government and to the army. And it's only when the army comes that the VDP is behind.
Okay.
So that
thank you very much for providing first-hand information and clarifying the situation on that. Now, David, you did mention the ballooning effect, and we do understand the geography and topography of the area where the border is porous, and once there's pressure on this violent extremists in one country, they easily just move into the next. Now, beyond Burkina Faso, how has the violence in Mali and the wider Sahel region spilled over into neighboring countries that are now threatening coastal states in West Africa? What are some of the regional implications of this conflict?
Of course, I just wanted to make a point, when my co-panelist was talking about the volunteer defense personnel, or the VDPs. This is a classic example of what, we saw with the Civilian Joint Task Force. In the case of, the Nigerian military combating Boko Haram in the Northeast in 2014, when they were being, brought up to, during the beginning, to identify some of the individuals that belong to Boko Haram, and then thereafter to almost act, as the intelligence eye of the military. So it's not a new strategy. There are so many lessons that the Burkina Faso government can learn from that. And one of those lessons will be to make sure that there is proper understanding and investigation in terms of the role that some of these individuals play. For example, whether they play double roles. I think that's quite important. In terms of the overall strategy, as my co-panelist said, counterinsurgency is not a step-by-step process. It is what we call a simultaneous process. So you don't say we will deploy the military first, and then we will do prevent programs, or we'll then bring in protection of assets or critical infrastructures later, or at the same time. But it has to be determined, of course, by different dynamics. Now, I understand that perhaps the Burkina Faso government faces resource issues. I mean, it may not have the necessary resources to carry out simultaneous programs. So what possibly they are doing is that if you just have the hammer in your toolbox, then you use it for anything that comes your way. So I think the challenge that the Burkina Faso government is facing is that it doesn't have the required resources, and leverage to deploy more than the military. So it's using that military to almost do everything, or almost anything. And I think this is where the challenge is for them. I think the best method that we know works in terms of counterinsurgency is that you deploy methods simultaneously. You bring in your prevent programs, which sucks away people that have been recruited into these groups. You apply your protection program that protects critical infrastructures and people, from being either harassed or attacked, by these jihadist movement. You bring in your rehabilitation and reintegration programs, demobilization and de-radicalization programs, to make sure that you try and get people that are already in, to exit, these groups. So these programs have to work simultaneously. But again, I do understand, and I know that the Burkina Faso government is struggling, to deal with these issues, because it does not have the kind of legitimacy that it needs, to reach out to the international community, and number two, it does not generate the kind of income or revenue within the state that it could use to leverage on its counterinsurgency process. So I do understand that. Now, talking about your question on regional implication, one must first understand that when we talk about non-state actors like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Burkina Faso almost benefited from its geopolitical positioning. It did get this spillover from Mali, from the likes of Niger Republic. So, because, this has almost been imported involuntarily into Burkina Faso, you would also have, a situation where this spillover would then transfer to other countries. So it's not surprising that you have the likes of of Ivory Coast and Ghana or Togo suffering from attacks, that are coming from Burkina Faso. It's what happens when jihadist movements, enjoy some level of safe havens in ungoverned spaces. So,
I guess at the end of the day, it shouldn't just be a Burkina Faso problem, because if your neighbor's house is on fire, you do face a grave danger. It's a fine place to go on a break. When we return, we'll continue our conversation on the situation in Burkina Faso. We'll be looking at the humanitarian situation and also solutions, potential solutions to ending this crisis there. Do stay with us. This is Secure the Continent on News Central Television. We'll be right back after this break. Back to Secure the Continent on News Central Television, and we've been discussing the rising violence, extremism in Burkina Faso. And joining me on today's program to discuss this, I have Dr. Lassane Ouedraogo, who is a research fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development. I also have David Otto, Director for Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies. They both join live from Abuja in Nigeria. Now, Dr. Ouedraogo, before we went to the break, David was looking at some of the reasons why and some of the obstacles the government in Burkina Faso might be facing as a challenge to dealing with this extremist violence. He mentioned finances and also other issues. But I want to put it to you as someone that is a Burkinabe, and you only just returned from Burkina Faso recently. What do you think, or what are the major obstacles facing the Burkina Faso government in regaining control over the territory, particularly in areas currently outside state control? What are the most pressing needs? And do you also feel that the departure of the French in Mali perhaps had an effect on the rise and the intensity of this extremism?
So I think my co-panelist was right when he mentioned the fact that economically Burkina Faso is unable to support the cost of this war, which has been how many years now? 8 years. It's really key that the country be able to buy the necessary weapons. But over the past years, it has not really gotten support from its traditional key partners in terms of military support, in terms of equipment, and et cetera, et cetera. So that is really fundamental. And we must also say that Burkina Faso is fighting a war which to some extent is imposed upon Burkina Faso. Because if we trace the root causes of these terrorist organizations, they did not emanate from Burkina Faso. It came from outside the country. And this is a regional problem. This is a global issue. But unfortunately, for some strategic reasons, I don't know, these countries are left alone to fight this conflict. There's a lot of political consideration in supporting whether it's Mali or Burkina Faso to fight against terrorism as well. And if you look at now MINUSMA leaving Mali MINUSMA did not have any mandate to go and fight terrorists. MINUSMA was there to maintain peace. What kind of peace do you maintain when there's no peace? So, and the international community has been there. France in particular, back in 2012, France was actively involved in actually helping fight, and the results were clear. But soon they returned to the barracks, and they are not really engaging in terms of operational fights directly against the terrorists. So I believe that is where the problem lies. Not only these Sahelian countries do not have the necessary means, but also they are pretty much doing it alone. And even today, up to now, Burkina Faso, terrorism from Burkina Faso is spilling into Ghana. Terrorism from Burkina Faso is spilling into Togo. But we don't see, and Benin, we don't see clear cooperation between these countries. We don't see joint military operations with support from our regional organizations like ECOWAS or the African Union for that matter. So I think what is really missing, the missing link is here, understanding that this conflict is not a conflict that belongs to one country. It's not a conflict for Mali. I think that's what the mistake that Burkina Faso did back in 2012, 2013. We used to believe that, oh, this is far away from us. This is a Malian conflict. It has nothing to do with us. And at some point, we even harbored some of these terrorists in Ouagadougou in seeking to negotiate between the Malian government and them back then. So, but today the result is that these terrorists do not know that. They will continue to expand if we do not cooperate, if we don't have cooperation between our different countries.
Thank you, Dr. Ouedraogo. Now, David, still following up on international efforts, like Dr. Ouedraogo said, there is a clear and present danger, and we've seen attacks at the W Park in Republic of Benin, Togo, and also northern Ghana. I mean, knowing this and knowing the trajectory and how this violent extremism could snowball, why is there limited cooperation led by ECOWAS countries? What are they doing to resolve this conflict, or do they feel, I mean, they're sort of far away from these dangers? Are there any cooperative, any collaborative efforts with the African Union in dealing with the situation in Burkina Faso? Because it seems Burkina Faso has been left alone to deal with these issues.
Well, I think, Gbenga, what we have to agree at some point is that, Africa keeps on relying on international donors or international partners in the West or in the East, to provide them with help and support, when it comes to national security. I mean, gone are those days. We have to move into a new era. And the problem continues to be that African countries do not contribute themselves, to deal with national security, partnership or collaboration. They always expect that it's either from the United Nations or from, some donors in the West. And what they fail to understand is that geopolitics is all about interest. It's not all about whether people are being killed in one part of Burkina Faso or in Togo or in Ghana or in Nigeria. It is about what it's on for them. So I think the biggest issue has been that, unfortunately for countries like Mali and Burkina Faso, their leadership is not, is not seen in the best light. They don't like the leadership because, of course, these are beneficiaries of coup d'etat, and the Western democracy does not encourage, coup d'etat. It doesn't encourage leaders to be in power, especially if those leaders, do not come from, their own mechanisms. Leaders like
but this same
Captain Ibrahim. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you,
Yes.
David, but this same Western leaders do business with non-democratic states like Egypt and the Gulf monarchies. So why is it so hard?
Yeah,
we
because
can clearly see the effect on the civilians, the innocent people dying in Burkina Faso. So why are they reluctant?
Nobody cares. Nobody cares about that, Gbenga, about the number of people that die. Man, if anyone cared about that, then the war in Ukraine could have had a solution. I think, as Africans, we have to revert to, agreeing that we have to deal with our internal issues. And that's why we need to strengthen the African Union. And by strengthening the African Union, I'm talking about, countries have to contribute, financially and resource-wise and human contribution as well, to ensure that the African Union has not just the monetary or fiscal capacity, but they do have the human capacity, to engage in proactive dialogue, to engage in military interventions that will deal with any insurgency that come to the continent. So we've got to establish that. When you have a continent or a country that does not control its security, they do not have an understanding of their threat index. Remember, security is not just internal, it's also external. So when you don't have an understanding of your threat index, your geopolitical situation, you don't have an understanding of your vulnerabilities, be it internal or external, then what you would always have is always have this kind of situation. But Burkina Faso, the country in question, is suffering today because, of course, they have shown their backs, on the French. They've shown their backs on any Western help. They want to do it themselves. But of course, there are these fears that they are leaning towards countries like Russia to help them. And you know how geopolitics work. Your enemy's enemy is my friend. So it's something that it takes a lot of toll to talk about how African countries can enjoy only regional or international support. Bodies like ECOWAS, they still rely very much on the support from outside. So we've got to look inside. Africa is not a poor continent. It's just underdeveloped. We have the required resources. But it boils down to one thing, Gbenga, leadership. And if we continue to have good leadership, a leadership that people trust, a leadership that cares about the development of the continent, we will move away from these situations where, we have wars everywhere and conflict and dependency situation. And that's what we're facing. And that's what Burkina Faso is facing today.
Thank you very much, David. Now, Dr. Ouedraogo, the Burkinabe military recently ordered the evacuation of civilians in certain regions ahead of planned military operations against violent extremist fighters. Can you discuss the potential risk and challenges associated with these operations, especially with the protection of civilians? Are they not adding to further displacement of Burkinabe civilians by engaging in this type of operation? Can you kindly unmute your device, Dr. Ouedraogo?
Okay, it's unmuted. Okay, one of the ways in which the government of Burkina Faso responded to the ongoing crisis is to actually assess and say, look, I have to rely on myself now. And this is quite something fundamental about Burkina Faso, that Burkinabe do not want to have foreign military foot on the ground. And even when the French were in Burkina Faso, they were not allowed to actually deploy and be actively fighting on the front line. So the departure of France from Burkina Faso did not really remove anything significant from the security matrix of the country, honestly. But the ways in which civilians are now involved in the conflict is that the government understands that this is not a conventional war. You need to have everyone involved. And the ways in which that general war would be won is if the people are on the side of the war, if the people are actually supporting the fighters who are actually out there fighting against the terrorists. Because these are not conventional armies that are just sitting somewhere and organizing and coming and fighting. They are also in our villages. We now have Burkinabe citizens giving the whereabouts of our army, giving the whereabouts of our military and our policemen to the terrorists. So you cannot win a war when you have that kind of situation going on. So you need to be able to build back trust with the people, to make them understand that this is a war that is going to be won, but it cannot be won alone. This is a war that you win with the people. And hence the recruitment of the VDP. And the VDP so far have been, you have two levels. You have a national level VDPs who can be deployed anywhere, but you also have village, regional specific VDPs. So who cannot go and operate in another village. So those are people who are recruited. They are home. Nobody even know within the village. You do not necessarily know who is a VDP. So, and I think this is fundamental in Burkina's effort to rely on itself in these dire times. because as my co-panelist was talking about the international community's role and the geopolitical considerations that come when we talk about supporting the war against terrorism. So,
now, Dr. Ouedraogo, do you think Burkina Faso can go it alone, looking at the current trajectory and also understanding the fundamentals of it, that there's almost an endless conveyor belt where these terrorists are coming from? They're not just they're not just Burkina terrorists. Yes.
Yeah, ideally, you do not do this alone. Ideally, you do not do this alone. You do it in collaboration with your neighbors. You do it in collaboration with the regional organizations. You do it in collaboration with the international community. And Burkina's hand is always there, asking for that kind of support. So, I was one of the people to say on this same panel a long time ago that there will not be a Wagner in Burkina Faso, because we're so proud of ourselves that if you were to support us in the fight, it has to be in our own terms. And the likes of Wagner do not do that, do not know that. And our neighbors too, if you to consider countries like Niger, and we've seen a few tension coming from Nigerian authorities targeting Burkina Faso. So that does not facilitate any collaboration on that side. And earlier this year too, we had tension with Ghana. Fortunately, those tensions have been resolved. But and we also had tensions with Togo and Benin in terms of border lines and so on and so forth. So those issues do not facilitate collaboration between us and our neighbors. And without forgetting the embedded relation that we have with our Cote d'Ivoire neighbor, because politics in Burkina is enmeshed with politics in Cote d'Ivoire. So when you consider all of these, and you also see ECOWAS, an ECOWAS that is very weak, an ECOWAS that is not only financially weak, but politically weak, an ECOWAS that is pretty much unable to affirm itself within the region, an ECOWAS that always waits for coup d'etat to happen before it raises red flag. So Burkina Faso finds itself in a quagmire that is very, very difficult, but it cannot sit back and watch. It has to deploy its own local mechanism. It has to devise ways to fight. So, and I think that's pretty much what the country has been doing since Captain Traore took over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ouedraogo. David, Otto, let's try and get into the mind. Let's understand the operations of this very persistent enemy that the Burkina government is up against. Can you provide some insights into the ideology, the drive, and also the mentality of this extremist terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, the IS, and these guys that are causing so much trauma in the Sahel region? And I also want to ask you if it's possible, are there groups that are open to negotiations? Because when Blaise Compaoré was president, he did that for a little bit, and some of the effects, some of the results, it did bear a level of some results. So what sort of enemy is the Burkinabe state up against?
I think specifically, talking about negotiations, just like many Western and African countries, Burkina Faso has the policy of non-negotiation with terrorist groups. But of course, it's a mantra. And I'm sure that, if there are avenues for negotiation, the terms of that negotiations will be agreed upon. But, the question is, what do the terrorists want and who are they? So identification of your threat is very important. But, the kind of enemy that they are facing, these are insurgency groups that are linked to the so-called Islamic State, because you have the Islamic State of the Greater Sahel, which is one branch. You remember the Islamic State of West Africa Province, which is also another branch in the northern part of Nigeria, and now spreading towards the west. So you've got that branch operating within, Burkina Faso. They call themselves Geneva. And then, of course, you have Al-Qaeda's route. But, they are not different in terms of their operations because, of course, they all belong to, the same school of thought, which is the Wahhabist jihadist movement. Now, I developed something, which, has been often used, called the terror triangle or the counterinsurgency triangle when you do reverse that. That triangle essentially talks about the three components that makes up an insurgency movement. And the first of that, at the top of the triangle, is always the motivational factors. I mean, the simple question is always what makes them to join these terrorist organizations and what makes them want to attack the government or attack civilians. You've got to deal with that. That's what we call the underlying causes, the reasons why they want to do it. But the reasons are never enough. So you extend to another triangle, which is called the capacity and capability. So how do they get their weapons? How do they recruit people? How do they get their money? We call that follow the money, follow the weapons, and follow the people. So when you deal with that angle of that triangle, then you have one side is dealing with the motivation, the other side is dealing with the capacity. The last part of the triangle is always to look at what you call the target. So who are they targeting and why are they targeting these individuals or targeting these assets? So you bring in your critical infrastructure and asset protection. So in the middle of that triangle, when you do your reverse engineering, you then have what we call the people themselves. So a people-driven approach. And this is why I said in each counterinsurgency, you've got to bring in the people. The people have to come in because, of course, no insurgency group can survive beyond a week if it cannot rely on the people that protect it. So it's quite straightforward, Gbenga. These are the kind of threats that Burkina Faso is facing. Whether you look at Burkina Faso or is in Niger Republic, which of course is linked to Nigeria, you still have these threats. And that's why one of my biggest recommendations would be to the Burkina Faso government. They have a fairly new young leader who is relatively young. And I think, what I would always suggest is that experience beats everything else. Nigeria is a country that has been fighting an insurgency of the same kind of ingredients, for the past, 2 decades. Why not contact some of these retired generals that, 120 of them have been retired by the Nigerian military forces. So some of these police officers that have experienced the insurgency, go through the ECOWAS, get them to provide you with this experience. And, you come up with an ECOWAS strategy. One that it's not just going to help Burkina Faso, it's going to help Niger Republic, it's going to help Mali, it's going to help Togo, Ghana, and Nigeria itself. Because there is a spillover that would impact, on Nigeria. So it's quite comprehensive. I can't give it in a minute, but,
okay.
That's what I have to say, Gbenga. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, David Otto. I'd like to say a big thank you to my distinguished guest tonight for your contribution and insights, Dr. Lassane Ouedraogo and also David Otto. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you both on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you.